Hello Story Storer listeners, before we start this interesting story, please subscribe this channel, Story Storer, and hit the bell icon. Thank you. Now here we go. ... The words landed like a slap, cutting through the hum of our modest dinner. You eat, but don't help. They came from my daughter-in-law, Laura. Her voice edged with a bitterness that seemed to have been simmering for years. The dining room went still, the clink of silverware against plates fading into a heavy silence. My son, Thomas, sat across from me, his gaze fixed on his untouched roast, his hands motionless. He didn't speak, didn't look up, didn't defend me. His silence was a wound deeper than Laura's words, a betrayal that settled into my bones. My grandson, Ethan, barely 5, fidgeted in his chair, his eyes darting between us, sensing the tension but too young to name it. I set my fork down, folded my napkin with deliberate care, and began clearing the dishes. Not a word, not a the soft scrape of ceramic, a rhythm I'd known for decades. That night, I lay in the spare room, a cramped corner of the house, with a narrow bed and a window that rattled in the wind. The ceiling had a faint crack running through it, like a river frozen in time, and I stared at it, waiting for sleep that refused to come. From the living room, I heard Laura's laughter, soft and warm, followed by Thomas's low murmur. A glass clinked against another, the TV droning faintly. Ethan was asleep, his small snores a quiet comfort through the thin walls. I hadn't cried since my husband, William, passed, but something cold and unyielding took root in my chest. A resolve, born not from one cruel comment, but from years of being pushed to the edges of my own life. I thought back, as I often did in the sleepless hours, to the years when William was fading, his body betraying him while his spirit clung to dignity. I was the one who changed his sheets, who measured his medicine, who read him passages from his favorite history books because he said they grounded him. I was the one who kept the house running bills paid, meals cooked, Thomas's clothes mended while grief carved its slow path through me. I remembered Thomas as a boy, his wide grin when I surprised him with a new bicycle, bought with overtime hours at the library. I recalled the nights I stayed up, sewing patches on his jeans or helping with his science projects, my fingers aching, but my heart full. And now I was a burden, a mouth to feed, someone who took up space in a home I'd built. I didn't leave the next morning. That would have been too abrupt, too loud. Instead, I stayed. I brewed coffee, the pot gurgling like an old friend. I swept the porch, dusted the shelves, braided Ethan's shoelaces into neat knots before school. I didn't argue, didn't defend myself. When Laura mentioned a weekend trip, the three of them, I nodded, smiled, said, "That sounds lovely." Thomas avoided my eyes, mumbled something about work. They left on Friday, their car crunching down the gravel drive, and I stood in the kitchen, the silence so thick it pressed against my skin. That's when I packed. Not much a suitcase with my clothes, a small box of keepsakes, and the leather-bound journal William gave me years ago, its pages soft from years of handling. I left the house key on the counter, next to a stack of dishcloths I'd washed that morning. No note, no explanation. I took a bus across town, my knees protesting with every step, and checked into a modest care home called Maple Haven. It wasn't grand plain walls, a faint smell of disinfectant, but the staff smiled, and my room had a window that caught the morning light. I sat on the bed that first night, the journal in my lap, and wondered if I'd made a mistake. Had I truly become a burden? The thought gnawed at me, but beneath it, a quieter voice whispered, "What if they're wrong?" The next morning, I called Margaret, an old friend who'd handled our legal affairs after William's death. Her voice was warm, familiar, like slipping into a well-worn coat. "Do you still have the house deed?" I asked. There was a pause, then a soft chuckle. "I've got everything, Ruth. You know I don't throw anything away." 3 days later, I sat in her office, the air smelling of coffee and old books. She slid a folder across the desk, and there it was, my name, the address, William's signature from 1993. The house, the one I'd been told to leave was mine, had been mine for over 30 years. William had signed it over before he died, his final gift to ensure I'd never be without a home. I hadn't known. I'd trusted Thomas to handle things after his father passed, and he'd never mentioned it. I stared at the paper, my fingers tracing the ink. Margaret leaned back in her chair. "What do you want to do, Ruth?" I didn't answer right away. I didn't know, but I knew this. I wasn't just someone who ate. I was the woman who'd built that home, who'd carried it through loss and lean years, who'd poured her life into its walls. I took the folder, thanked Margaret, and left, the weight of it steadying me like a heartbeat. Back at Maplehaven, I settled into a rhythm. I helped in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with hands that still remembered how to wield a knife. I read to Mr. Ellis, whose eyes were too weak for newsprint. I listened to Mrs. Carter talk about her days as a seamstress, her stories weaving through the quiet afternoons. I made friends, real friends, not out of obligation, but out of shared understanding. There was Elsie, who'd lost her home to her son's gambling debts, and Vera, whose daughter had moved across the country and stopped calling. We were a small band of the overlooked, our lives stitched together by stories no one else wanted to hear. One evening, Elsie and I sat in the common room, a puzzle half finished between us. She looked at me, her eyes sharp despite her years. "Why'd you leave, Ruth?" "Really?" I hesitated, then told her about Laura's words, Thomas's. Silence, the house that was mine but no longer felt like home. She nodded, her lips tight. "They forget who we are," she said. "But we don't have to." That night, I opened my journal and began writing, not just memories, but numbers. The money I'd given Thomas over the years, $1,500 for his first car, $3,000 for his wedding, $2,200 for Ethan's preschool. The total climbed, a quiet tally of love that had gone unnoticed. I wasn't keeping score, not really, but seeing it on paper reminded me. I had given everything, and they'd called me a burden. I called Margaret again. "I want to sell the house," I said. She didn't ask why, just got to work. The process was slow: appraisals, inspections, paperwork, but the house was in good shape, and the market was kind. I asked Margaret to keep it quiet, to let the sale go through without warning. "They'll get the notice when it's done," I told her. She nodded, her eyes soft but unsurprised. When the sale closed, the money landed in my account, a sum larger than I'd expected. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. I didn't spend the money on myself, not in the way most people might. I didn't want jewelry or trips or a fancy car. I wanted purpose. I found it in a small, run-down building on the edge of town, a duplex with peeling paint and a yard overgrown with weeds. It wasn't much, but it had potential, like a seed waiting for water. I bought it, named it Grace House, and set to work. I hired a local contractor, a kind man named Joe, whose mother had lived in a care home before she passed. He worked evenings, sometimes for free. Once he heard my plan. "You're doing something real here," he said, hammering a new porch rail into place. Grace House wasn't just a building. It was a promise, a place for women like me, like Elsie, like Vera, who'd been told they were too much or not enough. I painted the walls soft yellow, hung curtains I sewed myself, filled the rooms with sturdy furniture and books I'd collected over the years. I planted a garden, not fancy, but functional: tomatoes, herbs, a few roses for beauty. One invited Elsie to move in first, then Vera, then a woman named June, who'd spent her life raising foster kids only to be left alone in her old age. We weren't just residents. We were family, not by blood, but by choice. We built a life at Gray's house. We cooked together, shared stories, laughed over burnt casseroles and mismatched socks. On Sundays, we played cards, the table crowded with teacups and crumbs. June taught us how to make her mother's cornbread, the kind that stuck to your ribs. Vera started a book club, reading aloud because Elsie's hands shook too much to hold a novel. I kept the books, balanced the budget, made sure the roof didn't leak. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and in that small space, I found myself again, not the mother who'd been erased, but the woman who'd always been there. Waiting. Thomas called 6 months after the sale. I didn't answer at first, letting the phone buzz against the table. When I finally picked up, his voice was small, like the boy who'd once cried over a skinned knee. "Mom, we got the letter. The house sit's gone." I stayed quiet. Laura's furious. Ethan's confused. "We're staying with friends." "But it's temporary." I didn't know the house was yours." He paused, waiting for me to fill the silence. I didn't. "I'm sorry," he said finally. I should have said something that night. I should have stopped. I let his words settle, then spoke, my voice steady. "Thomas, I didn't sell the house to hurt you. I sold it because it wasn't my home anymore. You let me believe I was a guest in my own life. I gave you everything, 30 years of everything, and you let her call me a burden. I'm not asking for your guilt. I'm asking for you to see me, not as your mother, but as a person who deserved better." He was quiet for a long time. "Can we fix this?" he asked. I thought about it, really thought about it. "You can't undo what's done," I said. "But you can do better. Not for me, for Ethan, for yourself. Live like you understand what you lost." He didn't argue, he didn't beg. He just said, "I'll try," and hung up. That night, I sat on the porch of Grace's house, a quilt over my knees. The air smelled of lavender and fresh-cut grass. Inside, Elsie was teaching June how to knit, their laughter spilling through the open window. Vera was humming an old jazz tune, off-key but joyful. I opened my journal, flipped to a new page, and wrote, 2025 built Grace House, worth more than money, worth everything. I closed the book, leaned back, and watched the stars prick through the sky. For the first time in years, I felt whole. Months passed, and Grace House grew. We welcomed 2 more residents: Martha, a retired nurse with a wicked sense of humor, and Clara, a quiet woman who'd spent her life teaching piano. We added a small library, a corner with shelves I built myself, filled with dog-eared paperbacks, and a few classics. Joe stopped by now and then, fixing a creaky step or patching a wall, always with a story about his kids. The garden flourished, the roses climbing the fence like they had something to prove. We weren't rich, but we were rich in the ways that mattered: time, trust, the kind of love that didn't keep score. One afternoon, I was watering the herbs when Thomas showed up. He stood at the gate, hands in his pockets, looking like he wasn't sure he was welcome. I waved him over, and he sat on the porch steps, his knees bouncing nervously. "I've been thinking about what you said," he started. "About doing better. I got a new job, a steady one. Ethan's in school again. Laura, she's gone. It's just me and Ethan now." He looked at me, his eyes searching. "I didn't come to ask for anything. I just wanted you to know I'm trying, and I'm sorry. Not just for that night, but for everything I didn't see." I nodded, let his words sink in. "I'm glad you're trying, Thomas. For Ethan's sake, keep going." But this, I gestured to Grace House, the laughter drifting from inside, the garden humming with bees. "This is my life now. I'm not going back. I'm not waiting for you to fix what broke. I've built something here, something that's mine." He looked around, really looked, and I saw something shift in his face. "It's beautiful, Mom," he said. "You did this." I smiled, not for him but for me. I did. He left soon after, promising to visit again. I didn't hold my breath, but I didn't close the door either. That evening, I sat with the women of Grace House, a pot of tea between us. Martha was telling a story about a patient who'd proposed to her mid-surgery, and we were laughing so hard Elsie nearly spilled her cup. The air was warm, the kind of warm that wraps around you like a hug. I looked at these women, my friends, my family, and knew I'd done more than survive. I'd created something that would outlast me, something that said, "We are here, we matter." The days at Grace House settled into a gentle cadence, each one layered with small moments that felt like gifts. Mornings began with the scent of coffee and the soft clatter of dishes as we gathered for breakfast. June would hum old folk songs while she scrambled eggs, her voice cracked but steady, filling the kitchen with warmth. Vera, always early, would sit by the window, her glasses perched on her nose as she skimmed the local paper, occasionally reading aloud snippets about town events or garden tips. Elsie, slower to rise, would shuffle in with her cane, her sharp wit already primed for the day. Martha and Clara joined us soon after, Martha with a quip about the weather, Clara with a quiet smile that said more than words ever could. We ate slowly, not because we had to, but because we wanted to savor the company, the laughter, the simple act of being together. Afternoons were for work and rest, each of us finding our place in the rhythm of the house. I tended the garden, my hands sinking into the cool earth as I pulled weeds or pinched back basil. The roses, now in full bloom, drew bees that buzzed lazily in the sun, their hum a kind of music. Vera took charge of the library, organizing books with a librarian's precision, her fingers lingering on spines as if they held old friends. Elsie led our knitting circle, her hands steadier with needles than with anything else, teaching Clara how to cast on while trading stories of their youth. Martha, ever practical, helped with repairs, her nurse's training making her adept at fixing more than just bodies. She'd tighten a loose cabinet hinge or patch a torn curtain with the same care she once gave her patients. June, our storyteller, would sit on the porch, recounting tales of her foster children, her voice rising and falling like a river, drawing us in until the world beyond Grace House faded away. Evenings were our time to gather, to share the weight of the day. We'd sit in the living room, the lamps casting soft pools of light, and talk about the past, the present, the dreams we'd tucked away long ago. Sometimes we played records, the crackle of vinyl filling the room as we swayed to Ella Fitzgerald, or chuckled at Roland's off-key rendition of a Beatles tune. Other nights, we'd pull out a deck of cards, the table alive with laughter as Martha accused Elsie of cheating, only for Elsie to wink and say, "Takes one to know one." These moments, small as they seemed, were the threads that wove us together, a tapestry of lives that had been discarded but were now reclaimed. I kept writing in my journal, not every day, but when the need arose. The pages filled with more than numbers now, sketches of the garden, notes about a recipe June shared, a line from a poem Vera read aloud. I wrote about the way Elsie's laugh could light up a room, how Martha's stories made us forget our aches, how Clara's quiet presence was a balm for restless hearts. I wrote about the house itself, its creaks and quirks, the way the morning light slanted through the windows, painting the walls with gold. And I wrote about myself, not as the mother who'd been erased, but as the woman I was becoming, someone who chose to build, to love, to live on her own terms. One morning, as I was pruning the roses, a letter arrived. It was from Thomas, handwritten, the ink smudged in places, as if he'd hesitated before sending it. He wrote about his new job, a mechanic's position at a local garage, steady work that paid enough to keep him and Ethan afloat. He wrote about Ethan, how he'd started drawing again, filling notebooks with sketches of cars and trees. He wrote about Laura, how she'd left for good, taking her anger with her. And he wrote about me, words I hadn't expected, I see you now, Mom. Not just as my mother, but as someone who gave everything and got nothing back. I'm sorry. I'm trying to be better. For Ethan, for you, for me. I read it twice, then folded it carefully, tucking it into my journal. I didn't cry, but I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot I hadn't realized was there. I didn't write back right away. Instead, I took the letter to the garden, sitting on the bench Joe had built from scrap wood. The roses were in full bloom, their scent heavy in the air. And I thought about what it meant to forgive, not to forget, but to let go of the weight that kept me tethered to the past. I thought about Thomas, the boy who'd once clung to me during thunderstorms, the man who'd stood silent as his wife called me a burden. I thought about Ethan, his small hands clutching crayons, his future still unwritten. And I thought about myself, the woman who'd walked away from a house that no longer felt like home, who'd built something new from the ashes of her old life. That evening, I sat with the women of Grace House, a pot of chamomile tea between us. Martha was telling a story about a patient who'd smuggled a kitten into the hospital. And we were laughing so hard, Elsie nearly spilled her cup. The air was warm, the kind of warm that wraps around you like a hug. I looked at these women, my friends, my family, and knew I'd done more than survive. I'd created something that would outlast me, something that said, we are here, we matter. The months turned into a year, and Grace House became more than a home, it became a beacon. Word spread, and women came to us, drawn by whispers of a place where they didn't have to prove their worth. There was Lillian, a former baker whose children had sold her home out from under her, and Sarah, a widow who'd spent her life teaching music only to be forgotten by her family. We made room, rearranging furniture, sharing closets, turning the attic into a cozy bedroom with a skylight that framed the stars. The house stretched to hold us all, its walls seeming to expand with every new story, every new laugh. We started a community garden, not just for ourselves, but for the neighborhood. Joe helped us build raised beds, and we planted carrots, zucchini, and peppers, the earth yielding more than we'd hoped. Neighbors stopped by, first out of curiosity, then with offerings of their own seeds, tools, a basket of apples from a backyard tree. Children came to play, their laughter mingling with ours as they chased each other through the rows of sunflowers. Grace House became a hub, a place where people gathered not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It was a reminder that home isn't just a building, it's a feeling, a choice, a promise kept. I wrote to Thomas finally, a short letter that took hours to compose. I told him about Grace House, about the women who lived here, about the garden that fed more than our bodies. I told him I was proud of him for trying, for starting over. I told him Ethan was welcome to visit, to draw in the garden, to sit on the porch and listen to Martha's stories. And I told him I was happy not because I'd won, but because I'd found my place, my purpose, my peace. I sealed the envelope, dropped it in the mailbox, and let it go, trusting it would find its way. Thomas visited again, this time with Ethan. The boy ran to the garden, his sketchbook tucked under his arm, his eyes wide at the sight of the sunflowers. Thomas sat on the porch, quieter than before, his hands clasped between his knees. I read your letter, he said. I didn't know you could do all this. I smiled, sipping my tea. Neither did I, until I had to. He nodded, looking out at the garden where Ethan was drawing a bee perched on a petal. I'm trying, Mom. It's hard, but I'm trying. I reached over, touched his hand briefly. That's enough for now, I said. The years passed, and Grace House grew stronger, its roots sinking deep into the community. We hosted potlucks, inviting neighbors to share meals under the stars. We started a storytelling night, where residents and visitors alike shared their lives' tales of love, loss, triumph, and survival. Lillian baked bread for every gathering, her hands kneading dough with the same care she'd once given her family. Sarah taught piano to the neighborhood children, her fingers coaxing music from an old upright reed found at a thrift store. Martha led health workshops, teaching simple stretches and first aid, her nurse's heart still beating strong. And I kept the books, tended the garden, listened to every story, every tear, every laugh, knowing that each one was a thread in the tapestry of our home. One spring afternoon, as I sat on the porch with a chipped teacup in hand, a woman approached the gate. She was older, her hair silver, her walk slow but purposeful. She wore a hat that seemed too formal for a Tuesday, but it suited her, like a piece of her past she hadn't let go. She paused, looked around, then climbed the steps and sat beside me without asking. "You're the owner?" she asked. I nodded. She studied the yard, the bird bath, where a sparrow splashed, the wind chimes made from old spoons, the riot of flowers planted without order, but with love. "This place feels free," she said, her voice soft, almost confessional. She looked at me, her eyes tracing the lines of my face. The tremor in my hand I no longer hid. "Why don't you live with your children?" she asked, not accusing, just curious. I let the question linger, let it breathe in the quiet of the afternoon. Then I smiled. "I used to," I said, "but here, I'm needed, not tolerated. Number one asks me to earn my place. No one expects me to apologize for being alive." Her eyes softened, and I knew she understood, knew she'd felt the same weight of being pushed aside, of being seen as less. We sat in silence, the kind that holds more than words ever could. Inside, the kettle whistled, a familiar song calling me back. Elsie's voice rang out, arguing with Martha about the best way to cook green beans, their laughter spilling into the yard. The woman beside me smiled, a real smile, one that started in her eyes. "I think I get it now," she said softly. I nodded, sipping my tea. "Sometimes, walking away is the loudest thing you can do," I said. The sun dipped lower, brushing gold across the leaves, the porch, the wrinkles of our hands. Somewhere inside, Sarah began playing a hymn on the piano, out of tune but full of spirit. It wasn't grand, but it was enough to remind me that the quietest lives leave the deepest echoes. This isn't just my story, it's the story of every woman who's been told she's too old, too slow, too much. It's the story of every mother who's given everything and been asked for more. It's the story of finding your voice, not to shout, but to speak, clear and steady, until the world has no choice but to listen. I'm Ruth, a mother from Pennsylvania, and I've lived this every sharp word, every quiet sacrifice, every step toward a life that's mine again. Grace House isn't just a home, it's a testament to the strength we carry, even when the world tries to convince us we're weak. If this story touched you, if it made you nod or ache or whisper, "I've been there," then I ask you to do one thing: subscribe to the Story Storer channel. Share this story, like it. Let it ripple out to the women who need to hear it. The ones still sitting in someone else's house, wondering if they're enough. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? What's your story? Because here, at Story Store, we don't just tell tales. We remember out loud. We remind each other that our lives, our sacrifices, our quiet victories, they matter. Join us. Be part of this home we're building, one story at a time.